again in 2 Samuel chapter 1. We finished 1 Samuel last week. We'll soon be ready to get into the book of 1 Kings, but I wanted to go over the kings of the United Kingdom first. There were 3. They each served 40 years. Does anybody remember the first king of the United Kingdom? Saul. Who's the second king of the United Kingdom? Correct. Who's the third king? That's correct. We already read about the life of Saul. We read about the end of his life in the last chapter of 1 Samuel, a very tragic ending. I'm going to go over it again because it leads right in to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, in which King David will be soon placed in the position of the king of Judah. It takes him several years to become the king of Israel, which is the northern part of the kingdom, but he eventually does, and he becomes the greatest of the kings of Israel. In chapter 31, we see that Saul takes his own life. All 3 of his sons have been killed in battle. And we'll start reading with verse 4 of chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows," he was talking about the Philistines, "will come and run me through and abuse me." He didn't die immediately, so he wanted his armor-bearer to kill him. But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. I want to go to chapter 1 now of 2 Samuel. We're going to see an interesting thing that took place after the death of Saul. A person appears to David before he's king and tells him about Saul. As a matter of fact, he brings Saul's crown to David. Now, David had a lot of problems with Saul. Saul hated David when he found out especially that he's going to be the next king. But you will remember that David and Saul's son Jonathan were very, very close. Very good friends. Loved each other dearly. And Jonathan knew that it was destined for David to be the king. David was ordained as the king of Israel long before Saul died. And Jonathan knew this. Now we're going to see an odd thing here. David, even with Saul trying to kill him and do all he could to discredit him, David loved him. And David was married to one of his daughters. In fact, he eventually had both of his daughters. We'll read about later. But notice this story in chapter 1 of a young man that came to David with the crown, thought he was going to probably get rewarded for what he did, but he didn't get rewarded for sure. Evidently he lied, because we see in the latter part of chapter 31 there, not even the latter part, the first part, that Saul fell on his sword, and it says there that he died. the armor bearer died with him. Then it says in verse 6, the armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. Now notice here this story. After the death of Saul, chapter 1, verse 1, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man, "Who brought him the report? How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots, their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' And he asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." So he told this lie. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. This is the first time they got the news that Saul and Jonathan and the others were dead. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I'm the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. And here David is just fighting against the Amalekites. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down, and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Now I want you to drop down in chapter 1 and look at verse 24. Now this is where David is grieving and lamenting over the death of his dear friend, and also for King Saul. We'll look at the latter part of that. Verse 24, "Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold." Now Saul had a lot of faults later in life. When he began his kingship, he was great. He was spiritual. But then as time went by, he just kept going downhill, and until he was doing very bad things. And even when he was corrected, he didn't change. But he was a good leader, and he was well liked, and the economy was good, the army was good, and so he's reminding them of how much they had under Saul. Then in verse 25, "How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished." Sadly, people who are gay use a lot of scriptures sometimes to prove that it's okay. One of the scriptures that is used is this one, because David talks about this relationship between him and Jonathan is more wonderful than that of women. Now, there's all kinds of different love. I know in the King James translation of the scriptures, and even in the other translations of the scriptures, there's usually one word for love. And it can be used for God's love, Christ's love, a mother's love, a father's love, a man's love for his wife, which is erotica, friendship love, and it's all just one little word. Well, when the Greek language came along, they were more specific. They had special words for love. Agape love, that word agape, a beautiful word, a Greek word. You hear it a lot of times. There are churches named after agape. I've seen that quite a bit in other organizations. Agape love. This is God's love that it's just beyond us. It's the kind of love that we read about in the New Testament when Paul said that God loved us even while we were still sinners. So it's a love that it's never ending. That's agape love. There is eros, E-R-O-S, love, where we get the word erotica, which is a love between a man and a woman. It would be sexual attraction. Then there is phileo love. That's a Greek word. That's where we get the name of the city, Philadelphia. And it's the city of what? Brotherly love. So there's a word for brotherly love. So you see, there's all kind of words that can define love. There's all kinds of loves. And we can just look at it like that. This was a very close friendship. Phileo love. They both loved God, Jonathan and David as well. And so we could see that especially the love of God could be a love that's above all kinds of love, even between a man and a woman, or a mother and a father for their children. It's way above. So I don't think there's any problem here of anybody making an exaggeration here that this is some type of homosexual relationship. I just don't believe that at all, but I know it's been pointed out by the gay community. Now, in chapter 2, we want to move along because we're going to see that David is anointed the king over Judah. Now, Judah is where Jerusalem was. That's where, and eventually it became David's capital. And it consisted of 2 tribes. How many tribes of Israel were there all together? 12. That's correct. 10 of the northern tribes were referred to as Israel, and the 2 southern tribes were referred to as Judah, because one of the names of the tribes was Judah, and the other one was Benjamin. And they had a lot of territory. And you may think, well, whoever had the 10 tribes had the most territory. No, because Judah was the largest tribe and had a great deal of territory. So David is already appointed king of Judah, but it's going to be several years before he gets the northern kingdom. And one reason that is because Saul has another son who is taking care of the northern kingdom. After Saul died and Jonathan died, he had another son called Ishbosheth. And he ruled 2 years. And eventually, though, his throne was taken away, and then David took his place. So there was always war between David's and Saul's family. And there was this conflict. Now, David never did anything to harm them. He did not physically try to take away the northern kingdom. He just waited until God moved. And I want you to notice in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel that the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. Now, this shows you how long. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. That's where David's capital was at the time. And in that list there, we'll not read all of the mothers, the women he was married to, because he had quite a few women that he was married to. But his firstborn son was Amnon, and then his second, Chileab, and then his third, Absalom. All of these you're going to hear again. Adonijah and Shephatiah, and the sixth one, Ithream. So they were all born to him in Hebron. And this all happened before he actually became the king of the United Kingdom. So you'll see in verse 6 that Ishbosheth, Saul's son, has a general by the name of Abner. A general by the name of Abner. Abner's a good man. He was Saul's general, and now he's the general for Ishbosheth. But he and Ishbosheth become very angry with each other because Ishbosheth wrongly accused him of something. And notice what it was in verse number 7, the latter part. Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" And this made Abner very angry in verse 8 because of what Ishbosheth said, because he was very faithful to the family. And he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I'm loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Notice verse 11. Ishbosheth did not dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. Now what happened then? Abner, then, you know how politics is, he then rallied the people to support David. And of course, eventually then the people supported David, and Ishbosheth was just put out of the picture. Now, sadly, Abner gets killed by David's general Joab. And the reason for that is because Abner killed Joab's brother, although it was really not on purpose, if you'll read that section of Scripture. But then we see in chapter 4 that Saul's son Ishbosheth is murdered. And I'd like to start in verse 4. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. That's when they found out that they were all killed. His nurse picked him up and ran with him, but as she hurried to leave, she fell with him, and he became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. Now David took Mephibosheth in as one of his own and ate at the royal palace, and he even gave him property and all other kind of things. Now Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimnon the Beerothite, set out, and this is verse 5, for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. Now David gets very angry about this, that Ishbosheth, even though that they don't get along, was murdered in his own bed. They went to the inner part of the house, verse 6, as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah slipped away. They'd gone, verse 7, into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night, all the way to Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul." These people do these things thinking they're going to win the favor of David. It doesn't work. They said, "We got your enemy who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." David answered in verse 9, Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon and Beerothite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing me good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. This was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. So, a lot of tragedy going on. People trying to win David's favor. David always looked upon Saul and Saul's family as part of God's anointed. And he didn't take kindly to anybody killing God's anointed. And so one more thing we'll look at, and I'll stop, from chapter 5. And that's when he becomes king over the United Kingdom. And then we'll stop here. Verse 1, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel in their military campaigns. He became a very famous general, and they liked him. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became the king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years, and that comes, of course, to 40 years. Now, David, farther down, has to take over Jerusalem. At this time, Jerusalem did not belong to Israel. It was controlled by Jebusites, who were actually enemies. So David gets rid of them. Notice in verse 7, nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion. Now, you know Zion's another word for Jerusalem, which is the city of David. And then drop down to verse 9. Then David took up residence in the fortress, called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. That's where we're going to leave it, and we'll pick up with the very end of chapter 5 or possibly chapter 6 next time that we meet. Is there any comments about the text?